In a world where empires are built on stolen wealth, one young leader dared to say no. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. This is the story of a continent at the edge of awakening, a single week, a single defiance that shook the halls of power across the globe. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. 7 days. That was all the time the young captain had. 7 days to hold back the storm that had been gathering for decades. 7 days to stand against the vultures circling above his country. 7 days to turn whispers of betrayal into a declaration of defiance. The countdown began in silence. No public announcement. No newspapers carried the headline. No television stations dared to speak of it. But behind closed doors, in smoky boardrooms of Europe and America, men in expensive suits whispered the same name with a mixture of disdain and fear. Traoré, Burkina Faso, a land of dry winds and cracked earth, was never meant to make headlines. In the West. To them, it was just another small nation, rich in resources but poor in power, a place to be managed, extracted, and forgotten. Yet in the heart of this fragile land stood a soldier with fire in his eyes and a secret few could imagine. The first signal of danger came not from his generals nor from the people in the streets, but from a coded letter slipped under his door. It carried no signature, only a seal, the shape of a lion, carved into the wax. Inside, a single warning written in French, trembling ink on yellow paper. 7 days remain. Guard the gold, or all is lost. No explanation, no sender. Only urgency. Ibrahim Traoré read the words under the dim glow of his study lamp, his jaw tightening. He knew the message could only mean one thing: the country's hidden reserves of gold, the last unbroken vein of wealth not yet stolen by foreign corporations. To the outside world, these reserves were modest, almost irrelevant. But to Burkina Faso, they were survival itself. They were leverage, hope, and destiny. And if the rumors were true, the West had already set its eyes on them. The following morning, a convoy of black SUVs rolled through the capital. Inside, representatives of the International Monetary Fund, draped in arrogance and expensive suits, carried a new ultimatum. Burkina Faso's debts would be restructured, but only if the nation signed over exclusive control of its gold exports to Western firms. The meeting was suffocating. Behind polished mahogany tables, the envoys spoke of partnership and stability, but their words reeked of ownership. They demanded, not negotiated. And when Traoré refused to bend, they left him with a chilling reminder: sanctions, blocked trade, frozen assets, hunger. That night, as he stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, Traoré looked down at the streets of Ouagadougou. The people moved like shadows in the flickering streetlights, thin and weary from years of scarcity. Mothers held children whose ribs showed through their shirts. Vendors sold the last of their millet, bargaining not for profit but survival. A city of resilience, but also despair. And in that despair, whispers grew. Whispers of betrayal. 3 men within, his own circle, generals he once trusted, were already in contact with foreign backers. Their loyalty bought with promises of wealth and power. The knives were being sharpened in the dark. But what made this moment different? What transformed it from another episode of African exploitation into a storm that would rattle the world was the mystery buried beneath the soil. Old men in distant villages spoke of it around dying fires, Sankara's hidden vision, an unfulfilled prophecy tied to the nation's gold. They claimed that before his assassination, Thomas Sankara had marked a path for the future, not written in books or speeches, but carried forward in secret. Whether myth or truth, it haunted Traoré's thoughts as he walked alone through the silent corridors of power. The weight of history pressed against him, as though Sankara's unfinished dream demanded completion. The West thought they had time. They thought their ultimatum would break him. What they did not realize was that their pressure had lit a fuse. And the countdown had already begun. 7 days, a nation's gold, one soldier's defiance, and a move so bold it would shake the world. Burkina Faso had always been rich in soil but poor in sovereignty. Beneath its dry ground lay veins of gold, the kind that could have built schools, hospitals, and roads for generations. Instead, it fed the endless appetite of multinationals who drilled, extracted, and departed with armored trucks under the high watch of foreign security. The wealth of the land slipped silently across borders, while the people were left with nothing but dust. In the markets of Ouagadougou, the air was thick with smoke from cheap cooking fires. A woman with hollow cheeks sold her last measure of maize flour, her hands trembling as she counted the coins. Across from her, a boy barely 12 carried a bundle of firewood, his back bent under its weight. He should have been in school, yet the chalkboards stood empty, the teachers unpaid. Life had become survival, and survival demanded sacrifice. Traoré walked these streets often, unannounced, without the formal parades of power. He moved among his people like a soldier still rooted in the soil, listening more than speaking. Each face he saw was another reminder that Burkina Faso's struggle was not abstract policy. It was hunger, sickness, and despair etched into the very bones of his people. But beyond hunger lurked something far more dangerous: betrayal. He had once believed in the loyalty of his generals, men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him when the coup brought him to power. Yet whispers reached him from couriers and intelligence reports, midnight meetings, encrypted calls, foreign envoys slipping envelopes under the table. Men he had trusted were plotting a different future, one where Burkina Faso's independence would be quietly sold back to the West in exchange for personal riches. The IMF's ultimatum had only accelerated. The offer was simple: hand over Burkina Faso's gold to Western companies, and in return, the nation's debts would be erased. The generals saw opportunity. Traoré saw chains. Still, he could not move too quickly. The world was watching, and every decision weighed against him like a loaded scale. If he rejected the IMF outright, sanctions would come crashing down, plunging the nation deeper into famine. If he agreed, he would betray everything he claimed to stand for. The delicate balance of survival rested on a knife's edge. That was when the rumors of Sankara's prophecy returned. The elders spoke of hidden reserves, gold veins unregistered in colonial maps, concealed by revolutionaries decades earlier. Some dismissed it as myth, yet others swore by its truth. According to them, the land itself was protecting its children, waiting for the right moment to reveal its power. Traoré found no comfort in mysticism, yet he could not ignore the eerie timing of the lion-sealed letter. The following day, at dawn, he stood on the outskirts of a mining site, one of the few still under direct state control. The sun cast a pale glow over the scarred earth, where men worked barefoot with rusted tools, pulling fragments of gold from the soil with bleeding hands. No machines, no safety gear, no wealth, just sweat and despair. A child, no older than 8, approached with a pan of blackened water, swirling it until a flicker of yellow glinted at the bottom. He held it up with pride, as though he carried the nation's future in his tiny palms. Traoré's chest tightened. That fragment of gold, so small it barely reflected the light, was proof of what was at stake. If Burkina Faso surrendered its veins, it would surrender its soul. But the enemy was no longer just the West. The whispers in Ouagadougou grew louder. 3 generals, each with ties to foreign financiers, had begun consolidating influence. One commanded logistics, another intelligence, the third border security. Together, they could paralyze the nation in a single night. And though they had not yet moved openly against him, their silence in recent meetings was more dangerous than words. For 7 days, the clock would tick. Every decision Traoré made would be watched, recorded, and manipulated. The IMF would tighten its grip, the generals would sharpen their knives, and the people, the very people he swore to protect, would sink deeper into hunger. Still, there was something they did not understand. The West believed they were the only masters of strategy, that their sanctions and threats could bend weaker nations into submission. The generals believed loyalty was a currency that could be bought with gold. But Traoré carried something neither group possessed, the unyielding will of a man who had nothing to lose but his country's chains. On the third night, he called a secret council of his most trusted officers, men who had fought alongside him in the deserts against militants, men who still lived simply and whose loyalty was earned, not purchased. Around a dimly lit table, with only the sound of crickets outside, he spoke of the ultimatum, of the betrayal he suspected, and of the countdown already unfolding. "We stand at the edge," he told them, his voice steady but grave. "If we give them our gold, they will own our tomorrow. If we refuse, they will starve us until our people break. But there is a third path, one they do not see, and it begins tonight." The room fell into silence. The men leaned forward, their faces tense, awaiting a plan that none of them could yet imagine. Far away in the capitals of the West, reports trickled in. Their diplomats wrote of Traoré's stubbornness, of his refusal to bend. They dismissed him as inexperienced, reckless, a soldier out of his depth. But beneath their arrogance was unease. Something in his silence, in his refusal to panic, hinted at a strategy they could not decipher. And so, as the days ticked forward, the world stood unknowingly at the brink. 7 days, 7 trials, 7 moves that would decide not only Burkina Faso's fate, but perhaps the future of Africa itself. The countdown had only just begun. The countdown had begun. 7 days, each one a battlefield of shadows and choices, where the weight of history pressed harder on the young captain's shoulders. Day 1, the ultimatum. The morning sun burned through the haze as the IMF envoy returned, their faces pale and cold. In a gilded envelope lay the ultimatum. Burkina Faso had 1 week to comply, or sanctions would choke its markets. Wheat imports blocked. Fuel prices tripled. Banks frozen. The document was dressed in polite language, yet every word reeked of control. It was not a negotiation. It was a leash. Traoré signed nothing. He dismissed the envoys without ceremony, his silence more defiant than words. But as their convoy departed the palace, he felt the air thicken. The week had been marked. Oyaristy would not wait quietly for an answer. That night, whispers spread in the city. Traders spoke of goods vanishing from warehouses. Farmers complained of seeds withheld at border checkpoints. The sanctions had already begun. Day 2, infiltration. By dawn, rumors reached Traoré's ears of men moving in the shadows. Foreign. Mercenaries disguised as aid workers slipped across the northern border. Supplies meant for rural villages vanished. A convoy of weapons was intercepted, crates marked with humanitarian logos, but inside, rifles gleamed under the moonlight. Traoré's suspicion grew. He gathered his intelligence chief, demanding reports of infiltration. The answer chilled him. Rebel cells, long dormant, were being stirred awake. Gold was not the only prize. Destabilization itself was a weapon. In the barracks, soldiers whispered nervously. Some questioned whether their captain could withstand the storm. Others feared the generals, whose silence had become unbearable. Every glance, every pause in conversation felt like treachery waiting to erupt. Day 3. The blade in the dark night fell heavy, with rain sweeping across Ouagadougou. Traoré returned late from a strategy meeting, his convoy cutting through wet streets. As his vehicle slowed near the palace gates, gunfire cracked the silence. Bullets shattered the windshield, sparks spraying like fireflies. In seconds, his guards responded. The attackers melted into the darkness, leaving 2 of his men dead on the pavement. Traoré himself emerged unscathed, though a fragment of glass traced a shallow line across his cheek. The wound was small, but the message was carved deeper than any bullet. His time was short. The assassins had known his route, his schedule, his movements, which meant betrayal was closer than he dared admit. Somewhere within his own walls, eyes watched him not with loyalty, but with hunger. Day 4. The silent march. The city awoke not to gunfire, but to footsteps. Thousands filled the streets of Ouagadougou, not with chants or banners, but with silence. Mothers carried empty bowls. Children walked barefoot, their faces gaunt. Farmers held cracked tools above their heads as symbols of struggle. It was not a protest of noise, but of absence. Absence of food, absence of hope, absence of justice. The silence was heavier than any shout. It carried the weight of famine itself. Traoré stood on the palace steps as the crowd passed. He did not speak. He could not. The people were speaking without words, their message unmistakable. Save us, or we will vanish. That night, he did not sleep. He paced the halls, haunted by the image of hollow eyes staring back at him. He knew he could not let the West starve his nation into submission. But he also knew the generals were watching, waiting for his misstep. Day 5. The coded betrayal. As dawn broke, a message arrived, slipped to him by a courier who refused to reveal his name. Inside, a scrap of paper bore a series of numbers and symbols. At first glance, meaningless. But to Traoré's trained eyes, it was a code once used during the desert campaigns. He worked through the night, unraveling the cipher until its hidden words revealed themselves. One of the three has already chosen the West. Tonight they move. The blood drained from his face. He had suspected betrayal, but to see it confirmed struck like a hammer. One of his generals had crossed the line, but which? Logistics, intelligence, or borders? Each commanded power that could cripple him overnight. The palace grew colder. Every man's loyalty was now a question mark. Day 6. The gathering. Storm on the 6th day, word reached him of foreign troops moving along the edge of the Sahel. Officially, they were conducting joint exercises. Unofficially, they were poised for intervention. Satellite images showed convoys of armored vehicles and aircraft gathering near Allied bases just beyond Burkina Faso's borders. It was a threat wrapped in denial, a shadow that grew longer by the hour. Inside the capital, the generals tightened their circles. Meetings grew shorter, colder, punctuated by sidelong glances. One of them was preparing a final strike. Traoré could feel it. The mystery deepened. Was the lion-sealed letter warning him of this very moment? Was the prophecy of hidden gold not a myth, but a path he was meant to take? His mind raced with doubt, but his resolve hardened. If there was truth in the prophecy, it would be his shield. Day 7. The bold move. The final day arrived like a storm breaking over the desert. The IMF expected compliance. The generals expected weakness. The West expected collapse. But Traoré did not bow. He did not sign. He did not beg. Instead, he summoned the nation, and through a broadcast carried across Africa, he revealed what no one, not even his enemies, had anticipated. Burkina Faso had secretly consolidated gold reserves, not in foreign banks, but buried deep within the land itself. For years, miners loyal to the state had extracted and hidden away the treasure, beyond the reach of foreign hands. It was a declaration, not of submission, but of defiance. We are not beggars. We are not slaves. Our gold belongs to our children. Shockwaves rippled through the West. Analysts scrambled, diplomats panicked, generals clenched their fists in silence. In a single move, Traoré had flipped the board, turning victimhood into leverage.
But even as the broadcast ended, shadows
stirred. The rival general prepared his strike, troops quietly mobilizing in the outskirts of the capital. The battle for Burkina Faso's soul was not over. The bold move had shocked the world, but the true test was only beginning. 7 days. 7 trials. What began as an ultimatum had transformed into a storm that rattled empires. The world watched, holding its breath, as Burkina Faso's fate balanced on the edge of betrayal and defiance. The 7th day had ended with a declaration that sent tremors across continents. Burkina Faso's hidden gold reserves were no longer myth but reality, and Traoré had unveiled them before the eyes of Africa. The West was stunned, the IMF humiliated, and whispers spread across the Sahel that a new dawn had begun. But victories in the open invited betrayals in the dark. As night fell, Ouagadougou became a city of unease. The streets, normally restless with chatter and music, grew tense. The air felt heavier, as though the entire nation sensed the invisible hands moving against its leader. Soldiers at checkpoints stood nervously, fingers hovering near triggers. Mothers hurried their children indoors. Markets closed early. A storm was coming, one not of nature, but of men. The gathering of shadows, in the heart of the capital, one of the 3 generals made his move. His name had been whispered for weeks, his loyalty questioned but never proven. Now, under the cover of night, his troops shifted silently, block by block, securing intersections, cutting power to districts, severing communication lines. They wore no insignias, but their movements spoke louder than banners. This was not defense. It was seizure. Inside the palace, Traoré's loyal guards felt the change first. Phone lines that went dead, convoys that failed to report in. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was tightening a noose around the presidency. Traoré stood in the war room, maps spread before him, his officers tense, but waiting. He had expected this moment, though not its exact hour. The coded message, the warnings, the assassination attempt, all of it had pointed here. Now the traitor revealed himself not in whispers, but in steel. The standoff, it was past midnight when the palace gates trembled under the weight of armored vehicles. Spotlights carved across the walls and soldiers with hard eyes demanded surrender. A message was broadcast on state radio, hijacked by the conspirators. The general claimed Traoré had endangered the nation by provoking the West, and that order must be restored. But the city did not rise with him. The silent marches of day 4 had not been for generals. They had been for Traoré, and in their homes, people held their breath, praying their captain would not fall tonight. Inside the palace, every second thickened the tension. Traoré could hear the rumble of engines, the metallic scrape of weapons being chambered outside. His men looked to him for orders, fear and loyalty battling in their eyes. He did not flinch. He did not pace. He stood still, his hand resting on the map, as though weighing the nation itself beneath his palm. Then, with deliberate calm, he ordered, "Seal the vault." The vault of defiance. Beneath the palace lay corridors carved into the rock, where the gold reserves were kept under heavy guard. It was no longer just wealth. It was leverage, proof, symbol. If the general seized it, his coup would not only succeed but gain legitimacy in the eyes of foreign powers. If Traoré held it, the balance would remain unbroken. The traitor knew this. His first demand, screamed through loudspeakers outside the gates, was not for Traoré's resignation, but for the vault's surrender. But the young captain had already moved ahead. In silence, he had ordered trusted soldiers to relocate portions of the reserves into hidden locations, trucks slipping out under cover of night, guarded by men who owed no allegiance but to him. The general thought he was reaching for gold, but his hands were grasping smoke. The confrontation at 2:13 a.m., the palace doors burst open. Soldiers loyal to the conspirator stormed inside, their boots striking marble, rifles raised. At their head, the general himself appeared, face stern, eyes burning with the confidence of betrayal. The two men locked eyes across the grand hall. No words were exchanged at first. The silence was heavier than any command. Finally, the general spoke, his voice echoing, "You've endangered this nation, Ibrahim. The West will crush us for your arrogance. Hand over the vault and I will spare you." Traoré's reply was not a shout, but a whisper, carried sharp through the hall. "You already sold us long before the West came knocking." The air snapped. Guns raised. Fingers twitched. But Traoré did not move toward surrender. Instead, he gestured toward the broadcast equipment set up hours earlier for his speech. Cameras still glowed red, live, unseen by the traitor. Every word the general spoke, every threat he uttered, was spilling across the nation in real time. The trap had been sprung. The turning point. The general realized the cameras were live. Panic flickered in his eyes. His carefully crafted narrative of saving the nation dissolved under the weight of exposure. Burkina Faso's people, who had silently marched days earlier, now listened from radios and watched from televisions. They saw not a savior, but a usurper. Traoré stood firm, his uniform marked by the shallow scar of the assassination attempt, his voice steady as he spoke not to the general, but to the people. "This is the choice before us. Gold for foreigners, or gold for our children. I will not surrender our future, not tonight, not ever." The hall erupted. Shots rang out, smoke filled the air, steel clashed against steel, loyalists and traitors collided in the corridors, their shouts echoing through the palace. Blood slicked the floors, the fate of a nation spilling with it. But the general had already lost. His troops faltered, confused, torn between orders and the live broadcast condemning their leader. Some dropped their weapons, others turned their rifles away. The coup fractured before it could solidify. The decisive blow cornered, desperate. The general tried to escape through the side corridors of the palace. But there, waiting for him, were men he had once commanded, soldiers who had chosen loyalty to the captain over riches promised by the West. He was dragged before Traoré, his face pale with disbelief. The cameras still burned red. The people still watched. Traoré did not raise a weapon. He did not order an execution. Instead, he let silence reign for one long, crushing moment before speaking a single line that would echo across Africa. "This is what happens when you sell your country for silver." The general was taken away, not as a martyr, but as a symbol of betrayal. His fate would not be whispered in fear, but remembered in shame. The dawn after fire. By sunrise, the smoke had cleared. The palace stood battered but unbroken. Soldiers, loyal to Traoré, guarded its gates, their eyes hard but resolute. Crowds gathered outside, first in silence, then in song. Women ululated, men raised their fists. Children, for the first time in weeks, laughed in the streets. The attempted coup had failed. The gold remained untouched. The bold move had not only shocked the West, it had defied it. But beneath the celebration lay a deeper truth. This was no longer about one vault, one week, or one nation. It was about Africa itself. A single young soldier had shown the world that the smallest country, under the fiercest pressure, could still say no, and the world would never forget it. The sun rose heavy over Ouagadougou, its golden light breaking through the haze of smoke that still clung to the skyline. The city, battered by fear and betrayal, awoke not to silence this time but to a chorus of voices. From narrow alleys to the wide boulevards, the people gathered, their chants rising like a storm. "Traoré! Traoré!" Children ran barefoot between the crowds, their laughter carrying above the drums and horns that echoed through the streets. Women clapped, their ululations piercing the morning air. Men raised fists, not in anger, but in pride. For the first time in living memory, victory belonged to the people. The attempted coup had collapsed. its architect humiliated before the nation. The palace still bore scars of the night's violence, shattered glass, blackened corridors, bullet holes etched into marble. But it stood, a fortress not of stone but of defiance. Within its walls, Traoré emerged to address his people, his uniform stained not with medals of vanity, but with the dust and blood of the struggle. He did not stand above them on a balcony. He walked into the crowd, surrounded by guards yet untouchable by fear. The people surged forward, reaching for him not as a distant ruler, but as a brother who had stood where they stood, fought where they fought. When he raised his hand, silence rippled across the masses. His words carried no pomp, no hollow promise. They were carved from truth. Our gold is our soul. Last night they tried to take both. But we are still here. We are unbroken. Silence broke into thunder. The sound carried through the streets, over the rooftops, into the very soil of the land. It was no longer a speech. It was a vow, a covenant between a leader and his people. The ripples spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Paris, Washington, and London, the news hit like a hammer. The IMF's carefully constructed ultimatum had been not only rejected, but exposed to the world. The young captain had dared to unveil the hidden reserves, stripping their negotiations of secrecy and power. Analysts scrambled on television screens, their polished voices betraying unease. This was not expected. This is destabilizing the region. Traoré is reckless, dangerous. Yet beneath their words lay a deeper truth they dared not admit. For the first time in decades, a small African nation had humiliated the institutions of global finance and lived to tell the tale. Markets trembled, gold prices fluctuated, investors demanded answers. But what the West feared most was not the loss of Burkina Faso's gold. It was the spark that had been lit. Across Africa, whispers grew into declarations. In Bamako, murals of Traoré appeared overnight, his red beret painted in defiance against crumbling walls. In Niamey, students carried banners with his name during protests against foreign troops. In Dakar, musicians sang of him as the lion who guarded the gold. The legend was no longer confined to his borders. It was spreading, alive, untamed. Inside Burkina Faso, the aftermath was not without its shadows. Families mourned the soldiers who had fallen during the coup attempt. The scars of famine still marked the land, and sanctions loomed like vultures. Food was scarce, medicine remained locked away by foreign companies. But even in suffering, the people carried something they had not known in decades: hope. Traoré moved quickly. He ordered emergency convoys to deliver grain from hidden reserves stored by loyal officers. Farmers were given tools, not debt slips. Children were gathered into makeshift classrooms, chalkboards propped against crumbling walls. It was not wealth, it was not luxury, but it was the first step of rebuilding, done not by foreign aid, but by their own hands. And in each of these small victories, the people saw proof. They did not need to bow to survive. The IMF returned, with new offers, their envoys' voices dripping with false calm. They promised partnerships, whispered of forgiveness, even hinted at investments. But their arrogance had cracked, their confidence shaken. For every offer they made, Traoré's response was the same: "Our gold is not for sale." The simplicity of the statement enraged them more than any speech could. It was not rhetoric. It was a wall, unmovable, unshakable. The generals who had betrayed him were stripped of command, their faces erased from the halls of power. Some fled into exile, seeking shelter in the very capitals that had once courted them. Others were imprisoned, their voices silenced, but none were martyrs. The people remembered their betrayal, and history would remember their shame. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that golden week did not fade. Each day, new reports emerged of African leaders referencing Traoré in speeches. Some dismissed him as reckless, Others praised him as bold, but none could ignore him, and for the ordinary men and women of Burkina Faso, his name became more than a leader's title. It became a shield, a chant, a prayer. When children went to bed hungry, mothers whispered, "Tomorrow will be better." Traoré is still standing. The West had underestimated him. They had expected a desperate soldier, a weak man easily bought or broken. Instead, they found a symbol too large to silence. In the quiet of the palace one evening, Traoré stood alone, staring at the horizon. The sky blazed with the last fire of sunset, the land stretching endless before him. He thought of the letter that had begun it all, the lion's seal, the warning of 7 days. Who had sent it? He did not know. Perhaps it was an ally. Perhaps it was a phantom. Perhaps it was destiny itself. But as he looked out over the land, he understood something deeper. The prophecy of Sankara, the whispers of hidden gold, the struggles of his people. They were not coincidences. They were threads, woven through history, waiting for the moment to be pulled tight, and in that week the knot had been tied. The IMF had been humiliated. The generals had been defeated, the people had risen, and the world had been forced to look, if only for a moment, at a small nation that refused to bend. But the true victory was not in gold or power. It was in the question that now echoed across a continent. If Burkina Faso could say no, why not us? And as the stars pierced the darkening sky, the young captain stood tall, knowing this was only the beginning. The week that had begun in whispers ended in roars. Across the plains of Burkina Faso, across the rivers of Mali, across the deserts of Niger, and the coastlines of Ghana, the story of the Golden Week was carried like fire on the wind. The world had expected silence after the storm, but instead, Africa sang. The IMF's emissaries retreated, their reports cold and bitter, written in language meant to conceal humiliation. In their glass towers far from the Sahel, economists debated numbers and probabilities, yet none of them could calculate what had truly happened. For what Ibrahim Traoré had done could not be measured in markets or charts. He had given his people something that no institution could control: dignity. In Ouagadougou, children gathered around fires, repeating stories their parents told, of the night their captain refused to bow, of the hidden vaults of gold, of the generals who plotted and fell. Though the details blurred with retelling, the spirit remained intact. He had stood firm, and because of him, the people still stood. Traoré himself moved quietly through these days, not reveling in triumph, but laboring in silence. He met farmers, under the scorching sun, his boots sinking into the cracked soil. He walked through markets, greeting traders who had once thought survival was impossible. He sat with widows whose sons had fallen in the coup attempt, promising that their sacrifice was not in vain. He knew the truth. The battle was far from over. Sanctions still loomed. Hunger still clawed at the edges of villages. Foreign spies still lurked in shadows. But he also knew something deeper. The people had crossed a threshold. Fear no longer ruled them. The ripple became a wave. In Dakar, tens of thousands marched under banners reading, "Africa is not for sale." In Bamako, murals of Traoré's face in red beret covered walls once painted with advertisements for foreign companies. In Kinshasa, singers wove his name into ballads of liberation, their voices echoing in crowded streets. And in Accra, a group of students stood before the gates of Parliament and shouted words that shook even their elders. If Burkina Faso can nigh, keep its gold, why can't we? The West had tried to dismiss it as fleeting, a week of noise, a footnote in history. But history does not forget the moments when chains first rattle. Inside the African Union chambers, leaders who once whispered obedience now found themselves cornered by their own people. Some condemned Traoré as reckless, fearing Western reprisal. Others admired him in silence, too cautious to declare it aloud. But all of them, whether ally or critic, knew they could never again ignore him. For the Golden Week had planted a seed that could not be uprooted. As weeks turned into months, the IMF returned again, but this time their language had changed. They spoke not of ultimatums, but of dialogue. They promised partnerships instead of punishments. But their smiles carried no weight, for the mask had been torn away. Traoré listened, but he did not bend. "Our gold is not for sale," he repeated, his voice as steady as the Sahel winds. The words became a refrain, echoed in speeches, sung in chants, etched into walls. They were more than policy. They were identity. Yet behind every victory lurked the shadows of struggle. Hunger did not vanish overnight. Schools still lacked books. Soldiers still stood watch at fragile borders, uncertain of what lay ahead. The road to freedom was long, broken, and dangerous. But hope, that fragile ember, burned hotter than it ever had before. And it was not only Burkina Faso that carried it. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Traoré sat with his advisors in a dimly lit chamber. Maps of Africa lay across the table, dotted with marks and notes. Each symbol represented not territory, but sparks, movements, protests, strikes, demands. "This is no longer just about us," one advisor said quietly. Traoré nodded, his gaze heavy. No, it never was. The realization hung over them like prophecy. The Golden Week was not the end of the story, it was its beginning. Far away, in capitals where suits replaced uniforms and contracts replaced chains, the powerful debated how to contain him. They spoke of sanctions, of isolation, of propaganda. But beneath their strategies they trembled, for deep within, they knew that no weapon is more dangerous than an idea whose time has come. And Traoré was no longer just a man. He was an idea. In the villages, when rains returned and crops began to sprout, farmers knelt in their fields and whispered prayers not only of survival, but of gratitude. In the cities, young men and women painted murals of lions breaking free from cages, the four, chains shattered at their feet. In classrooms, teachers told their students that they were the heirs of something greater, a future not defined by debt, but by freedom. And everywhere, in voices rising from every corner of the land, the question grew louder, echoing like thunder across the continent. If Burkina Faso can rise, why not us? The world had been shocked by a single week, a defiance carved into gold and blood. But the greater shock was yet to come. For that week was no longer history, it was prophecy. As night fell over the Sahel, the stars shimmered with ancient light. The same stars that once guided caravans across deserts, the same stars under which Sankara dreamed of a new Africa. And now, beneath their eternal glow, Ibrahim Traoré walked with steady steps, carrying a torch lit not by gold, but by the unyielding will of his people. The IMF would return. Enemies would conspire. Hardship would endure. But something irreversible had already happened. The chains had cracked, the silence had broken, and the future, once stolen, was reaching back into the hands of Africa's children. And so, the narration closes with a question not asked in triumph, but in solemn burning hope. Was this the week Africa's future was reborn in gold?